This is a time of great opportunity for BHP. The resources we produce are essential to the energy transition and global economic growth. Our products are fundamental to the way we live now and into the future. Now more than ever, we need to provide the world the resources it needs responsibly and sustainably. Imagine what we can achieve if we continue to think big.
Good morning. I'm Peter Bryant, Chairman of the Development Partner Institute. I'm joined today by Simon Wandke, the CEO of ArcelorMittal Mining. And I think, as I've got to know Simon over the years, one of the thoughtful and most visionary leaders within the mining industry. Welcome, Simon, to this virtual event.
Thank you, Peter.
Great. So before I jump in, I just wanted to set some context for our discussion around the challenges and opportunities of bringing all stakeholders together to drive transformative change in the industry. So as we know, this has been an extraordinary year. And one of the things we've seen is that sustainability, ESG, social inequality have been catapulted to the top of every organization's agenda. And that covers all industries, all companies, governments, and society. And what's being demanded of us is to accelerate the changes that have been in process for a number of years, and the bar has been set higher by society. And within the mining industry, that's further complicated by further erosion of what I call the triangle of trust between government and communities and the mining companies. And it's within this backdrop that I think there's a tremendous set of opportunities, but also challenges to make the necessary progress. I was at a session a couple of weeks ago at Milken Institute where a board member of Barrick Gold and Chevron said the multi-stakeholder approach is necessary to break the dominance of a few in the marketplace of ideas. And I thought that was quite a profound kind of insight from that person. So there's I think the enormity of the task ahead of us as an industry and as a society is fairly significant. And I think Simon brings a lot of thoughtful thinking and new ideas to the table about how we can do this. But Simon, before we jump into this, maybe not everybody's familiar with ArcelorMittal as a mining company. So maybe if you just spend a few minutes familiarizing our audience with your role and the footprint that Arcelor has in the mining industry.
Sure, thanks, Peter. So, I mean, most people know ArcelorMittal as a steel company, and people say the world's largest steel company, but I think probably one of the most interesting steel companies as well. It's a vertically integrated model. So we have a mining group, which I'm CEO of, and we produce about 60 million tons of iron ore globally, and about 6 million tons of hard coking coal. And it's quite spread out. So in a lot of jurisdictions, we have 14 assets, 24 mines. We're across 8 countries. And we beneficiate most of our materials, so concentration, tailings. We're right in the thick of many issues. Clearly, safety is our core. And the interesting part, I think, about being in a vertically integrated business like ours, which is a bit rare in the steel sector, is that R&D is a massive driver of value in our business. We spend a lot of time getting it right in terms of the R&D leverage into our business. So just a snapshot, and it's I think the topics you're raising today, Peter, are very, very front of mind, and I hope today we can talk through some of the sort of learnings. I think I never stopped learning. That was my father's objective in life: never stop learning. And right now, I'm still making learnings in this space. So let's get into it.
No, absolutely. I think some of us feel that we're in preschool on some of these topics, right? It's so big. So, Simon, let's get straight into it. So Paul Polman, who was the CEO of Unilever, talks about the kind of transformations that we're thinking about require a whole of value chain approach. So as you kind of sit there within ArcelorMittal, and I think it is interesting that you're vertically integrated, how do you think about that in terms of just the whole mining industry as a whole, and in particular ArcelorMittal?
Yeah, it's a good point, Peter. I'd just go back about 3 years ago. In fact, we had some approaches from the big names in the European auto sector who asked about what was our ability to define, from an ESG point of view, the assurance around raw materials. And I remember at the time thinking, well, it's fine, but of course it's not just me, and they don't have that perspective. And so quite a conversation internally between ourselves and the steel group, to the point where today we've adopted IRMA as our assurance model, which we're rolling out across mining globally. And that links in with what steel has adopted as responsible steel. So we've got a connected methodology of assurance, which we can sit in front of those automakers who are very powerful in the flat steel sector. And I think at first I remember being quite nervous, but I've got nothing to hide. And I think it's an interesting part of what you sort of said in your intro was the perspective is if you've got nothing to hide, then you should go all the way. And I think that's what we're doing at the moment. We're basically looking at this as it's an initiative which gives us, is good for the customers of our steel group. It's good for us from the point of view of getting up the maturity curve in terms of the quality of our businesses, because this is externally audited from the steel side and mining side. But also, it gives that piece of assurance in a common language across all mines. And I don't know if that means much, but when we do it in tailings, it's been very critical to have a common language, common audit methodology, and a sort of common set of actions across that. So, I think that's what that benefit, and that's available to us in an integrated vertical model, which allows us to cover many fronts. So ESG, CO2 reduction, et cetera.
Sure. Okay, that's interesting. Actually, you bring up a good point too, Simon, around transparency. And sometimes, the kind of regulatory level of transparency is not sufficient for investors, society, communities. So how do you guys think about transparency in the context of that?
Yeah, so I think one point is, as I said, this is one methodology which we're applying, and it's global. So it's not a local standard for a start. So we're raising, particularly, and I mentioned we're in 8 countries. Some of those are developing and some of those are very developed. So we have a maturity curve of audience of the community in which we operate, and we have a maturity curve of expectations sitting around us. So I think if you come in at the elevation where you have a global set of standards, which allow you then to display that transparency. For example, grievance mechanisms. Do you really have a two-way grievance mechanism? Do you really have an ability to have that conversation, an authentic conversation?
Yeah, no, I think that's important. And I think even being transparent about the fact that you do have different sites, there are different levels of maturity in itself is an important comment, because a lot of companies actually don't reveal that or open about that. So you don't get an equal level of performance. So one of the things too, with DPI, you guys are involved in the Rockefeller Foundation initiative, which not only brings the auto companies in, but we've got there's big investor groups in there like Hermes and Goldman Sachs and indigenous people. Do you think it's important bringing all those stakeholders into the room? And if so, why is it important?
Yeah, look, I think, and so thank you from ArcelorMittal to you for inviting us.
Sure.
I was attending your program in Italy last year, which was basically, I call that mine to customer, I guess. You had church groups, you had a very, very wide spectrum. I think it's fantastic. So under the concept of having those conversations in a relatively safe place where you can test your own thinking, but you can also hear other divergent thinking. And I think it's a critical part of that growth path, absolutely critical. So, I think, you mentioned Paul Polman, and I always think of the word courageous if I think of what he talked about. It takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage to reach out and build those coalitions. But no better way than what you're proposed and what you did last year in the Rockefeller Foundation in Italy to have a sort of safe house conversation.
Yeah, and that's and it's good, and it's continuing right now with these sprints, and more people are coming into the tent. So actually, we bring up communities, and I talk about this triangle of trust, and we won't get into the specifics of any incidents, but we know that the trust level between communities and mining companies is not strong, and it's also in the context of just low trust in corporations and government in general, through the Edelman Trust Index. So we're not alone, but how do you guys bring in communities in a thoughtful way so they feel they're being heard, and we're not just ticking a box saying we had the town hall meeting with them and off we go? This is pretty important. Yep.
That's a good point. I think, for a start, I mean, we're in iron ore and coking coal, so we're not talking about, a small non-ferrous deposit. We're talking, I mean, some of our deposits are now 42 years old, and I know the mine plan is another 40 years to go, so I'll never see it finish. But when you've got such a long-term horizon you're dealing with, you have to do some pretty extraordinary things. And I sort of, one example I think was during Ebola in Liberia back in 2014. Tremendous direct hit on the country and the region. And, there was a conversation internally because we were trying to get traction, not only to care for our people and our employees, but, the communities around us in which we serve with hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. But it ended up that we sort of initiated a program which was called the Ebola Private Sector Mobilization Group, a bit of a mouthful, but we had up to 100 companies, we had NGOs in there, and what it did was it created a conversation about needs, about opportunities, and about help. And I think in the end, people often talk about this. ArcelorMittal was recognised by the Clinton Foundation for the action, but it had nothing to do with ego. I can tell you the moment that was dreamt up in the office here in London, and the moment was, what are we going to do that's extraordinary? And you don't do that just being nice or anything. It was a long-term vision about how do we cement that relationship with government, with the people, the communities, and it ended up being neighbouring countries, which was a tremendous program. And in fact, we did it again for COVID this year. We started it again with a COVID program. We went through a number of iterations where suppliers, competitors, customers, the whole chain in multi-countries around the parts of Liberia this was in West Africa. So I think we learn about our own capabilities, but we also are showing that image of a company that cares for the long term, and we're there for the long term. So to me, I know sort of divert to that, but I think it's a really important point, is that it takes, back on that courage thing, it takes courage and major leadership when you're going to be there for a long time. We have a responsibility. I mean, that's a big word, but we have a responsibility from mine development through to closure, and that's a long horizon.
It is, absolutely. Yeah, and I like that notion of care for the long term, and also that's very much about legacy as well, right? So, I mean, the legacy of your company extends beyond closure, which is interesting. So one other thing before we might jump into the environment itself, but so Matthew Kuhn-Cum, who's on the DPI board and is former Grand Chief of the Cree Nation in Canada and sits on the board of Newmont, he said that communities don't want consultation, they want participation, and in fact find consultation rather insulting as a concept. So, and I know consultation is kind of embedded in prior and free consent, so FPIC. So what's your reaction to that kind of comment? Because it's pretty profound, I thought, in terms of what he was saying.
It's a good comment. I mean, I'm old enough to say at university I was taught the the wrong way, but and I always go back to that sort of that learnings thing. But I think you've got to go through a process, and that process, first of all, and it doesn't have to be just Indigenous or original owners of land. I'm talking about that broader stakeholder piece. But if you don't try and understand, you won't get anywhere, right? And the only way you're going to understand is to have a conversation, and that conversation has to be built on trust. So it's going to take time, and you really have to be prepared to learn, and what you hope comes out of it, at least share the outcomes, which allows you then to manage the expectations. And I think that's part of that fear factor, is that if I just tell, or if I just give a document, it seems to be less fearful, but actually it probably creates more barriers because you're not allowing that conversation. And I'm very thankful, and I can describe the day, and this I won't name the year because it's decades ago, but as a graduate, when I was working my first mine in the Northern Territory in a very remote location, it was an Aboriginal reserve, so we actually couldn't go anywhere on the weekend without permission from the elders. And we had a community person, and I always looked at the township houses which the government built for the Aboriginal people, and it was a shocking mismatch of what was required, what was needed, what was understood, and we'll just build a Darwin-based house for these people and everything will be fine.
Yeah.
There was one guy, and I don't remember his name, but I feel very honoured to have met him and worked with him. He was working for us at the time in the company, BHP, and he'd had that conversation, as I would call it today, and he built a little concept village well away from where our mining area was, based on the needs of the people. And it didn't look fantastic in the sense of what you might expect to see, but it allowed me to have that conversation that day as a young sort of know-it-all graduate, and I learnt a lot that day, I remember, and it stuck with me for life, is that if you don't try and understand what the needs of the constituent parties are, then you're just going to get it wrong because you're basing it on assumptions. And I think that's now playing out for us in Canada. I really, being Atlantic based these days, I really enjoy a lot of the movement, a lot of the action that's going on in Canada, the quote you mentioned. And we're in Quebec. We have our biggest mine, in fact, in Quebec.
Right. Yeah.
And early this year, on a weekend, and I would say the reason for that is to stay away from the noise of day to day. But on a weekend, I had the honour of spending the day with the chief of one of the nations there, and there was things I learned that day, a lot older than the first day in the Northern Territory many decades ago, which were again learning events about the needs of the First Nations people in this case, who are the original owners of the land and our neighbours. And that's led on to a lot more unpeeling of the onion in this year.
Yeah.
And there's when you start to have those conversations, things pop out. And for example, there's been a conversation recently that when some sacred events have been happening near the mining areas, that the people have been disturbed by the fact that mining trucks have been whizzing through, or people have been walking past, or so there's a respect question. But if you don't understand there was something happening, so what we're doing is setting up mechanisms, but whereby in that case the Innu people will tell us when they're going to have one of those sacred events or a particular ceremony, and we'll tell our contractors and our employees to stay away, because we want to be able to respect that. And I think you have to drill down and drill down and drill down. And what you're doing is, you're learning and you're building trust. Yeah. And I know that the local team up there is even looking to undertake Innu cultural awareness training in Q1 next year. That's a big step. And I think we have a massive bridge to run there, even though we've been there for 40 years.
So I mean, that's really, that's really insightful. And our clock is running down, and I feel that we're just getting started into this and scratching the surface. So I think just your kind of notion, and I think it's easier said than done, which is just being so open-minded that you really are in the mindset of being learning and always being open to different perspectives. And that is part of building trust. And we know that just from basic human relationships. I love the story around the concept village based on the needs of that stakeholder group. And I think when you bring multiple stakeholders in, it's critical to understand everybody's needs and wants through their eyes and reconcile that. The adoption of a universal standard, I think, across your different sites, irrespective of the different maturity levels, I think is really important, being transparent about that. And I think the example of the Ebola in Liberia and the conversations that you had and the accolades you got for that, and the notion of care for the long term is so valuable, and particularly, I think there's a lot of conversation currently going on is how do we reconcile the short-term demands of the market, quarterly reports, shareholder value, with the longer term nature of the challenges that we face. And finally, I just want to thank you. I mean, I think you are a courageous leader, by the way, just having these conversations, being open to learning, and are showing the leadership for the rest of the industry as well. So in our very brief time together. Thank you, Simon. Any last comments to our audience to say that, as we're embarking on this multi-stakeholder journey, what would be one thing you would recommend to everybody in the audience that they should do?
Well, I think you go through that little sequence I talked about with understanding and learning and digging in and setting aside your own barriers to that learning. You've got to be prepared to learn something new about how other people expect things. I think then it's about the word expectations comes to mind, because this is all about managing expectations. And at the end of the day, it's data gathering. You mentioned sort of annual reporting, that all carries on, but at the end of the day, you need to have a conversation, a culture in the organization that allows that conversation to be quite open, where the 30,000-foot strategy is conflicting with the 1-foot ground level issue with a stakeholder. And I think that's the ambition I would have, at least, that we have. We train our people to have that radar, and we actually build a culture which accepts that as I say, the 30,000-foot nicely written strategy document, purpose, vision, blah, blah, blah. Good, it has to be there. But when you come to practice that at a diverse country level, developing or otherwise, you can run into barriers. And I think you have to be able to manage those expectations. It's part of our skills as the sort of new leaders. Yeah.
Great. Simon, thanks very much for your time today. A good evening to you in London, and it's good afternoon here in California. So again, thanks for the time. A very insightful discussion. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Peter.